The old Regal Theater had always been a fixture in the small town of Darrow Creek. It was a relic of the past, with its crumbling marquee, faded red paint, and weathered, now showing board that hadn't been updated in years. Once a beacon of entertainment in its heyday, the theater now sat mostly empty, save for the occasional indie film screening or local event. But what drew people to the Regal wasn't just the movies, it was the rumors. For decades, locals whispered about strange occurrences in the theater. Lights flickering when the power was steady. Shadows moving in the aisles when no one was there. Muffled voices echoing from the old projector room, long abandoned and locked. Some said it was haunted by the spirit of an usher who died there in the 1940s. Others spoke of a fire that had claimed the lives of patrons during a packed showing of Gone with the Wind. Regardless of the story, everyone agreed. The Regal Theater had an eerie presence, one that lingered long after the credits rolled. For Ellie, it was just another job. A recent college graduate struggling to pay her bills, she'd taken a gig as the Regal's night manager. A fancy title for someone who locked up after late-night screenings and made sure no one vandalized the place. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. The theater was just an old building with creaky floors and bad wiring. Nothing more. Her first few weeks were uneventful. The theater rarely had more than a handful of patrons, and most screenings ended early. She'd spend her nights wandering the empty lobby, checking her phone, and occasionally flipping through a script for a play she was writing. It wasn't exciting, but it paid the rent. Then came the night of the Midnight Horror Marathon. The event had been advertised for weeks. A back-to-back screening of classic horror films, starting at midnight and running until dawn. To Ellie's surprise, the event drew a decent crowd. By 11:30 p.m., the lobby was buzzing with excited chatter as horror fans in costumes lined up for popcorn and tickets. Ellie manned the concession stand with Martin, the theater's part-time projectionist and self-proclaimed horror aficionado. "You ever hear about the phantom seat?" Martin asked as he scooped popcorn into a bucket. Ellie rolled her eyes. "Let me guess. Another ghost story?" "It's real," Martin insisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say there's a seat in Theater 3, Row J, Seat 12, that's cursed. People who sit there claim to feel someone breathing down their neck, or they get up and find their seat cold, like someone was sitting there before them. And once, someone even swore they saw a face in the reflection of the screen. Right behind them." Ellie snorted. "Sure, Martin. And I bet the phantom seat also eats popcorn and does your taxes." "Laugh all you want," Martin said, grinning. "But I wouldn't sit there if I were you." By midnight, the movies were underway, and the theater settled into an eerie calm. Ellie made her rounds, checking each theater to make sure everything was running smoothly. The first two theaters were uneventful, filled with the muffled screams and ominous soundtracks of old horror films. Then she entered Theater 3. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering light of the screen. Ellie's eyes scanned the rows of seats, counting heads to make sure no one was sneaking in or causing trouble. As she reached Row J, her heart skipped a beat. Seat 12 was empty. It wasn't just empty, it looked wrong. The cushion was sunken, as if someone had been sitting there moments before. And yet no one was near it. The rows around it were full, and no one seemed to notice anything unusual. Ellie shook her head. Martin's stories had clearly gotten to her. She moved on, dismissing the thought as nothing more than an overactive imagination. But as she turned to leave the theater, she could have sworn she felt a chill, like an icy breath brushing the back of her neck. The next few hours passed without incident. Ellie busied herself cleaning up the lobby, restocking supplies, and scrolling through her phone. The Regal's old clock struck 3 in the morning, its chime echoing through the empty halls. She decided to make one final round before settling in to wait for the last movie to end. When she reached Theater 3, the room was eerily quiet. Too quiet. The film was still playing, but the audience seemed unnaturally still, their faces illuminated by the pale light of the screen. Ellie frowned, stepping closer. It wasn't until she reached the middle of the theater that she realized something was very wrong. Everyone was staring at row J, seat 12. The patrons sat frozen, their eyes wide and unblinking, as if transfixed by something Ellie couldn't see. Her breath hitched as she followed their gaze. The seat was no longer empty. A figure sat there, hunched forward, its face obscured by shadows. It was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, its clothes faded and worn, like something out of the 1940s. The figure's head slowly turned, as if sensing her presence. Ellie's blood turned to ice as the figure's face came into view. It was pale, almost featureless, with deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of impossibly sharp teeth. Ellie, it rasped, its voice a low, guttural whisper that echoed in her ears. You shouldn't be here. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights in the theater flickered, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. The patrons blinked, as if waking from a trance, and turned back to the screen, completely unaware of what had just happened. Ellie bolted from the theater, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her radio. Martin, she hissed, get to the lobby. Now! Martin found her in the lobby, her face pale and her breathing ragged. She told him what she'd seen, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. Martin's grin faltered, his usual bravado replaced by unease. I told you, he said quietly. Row J, seat 12. The phantom seat. Martin, this isn't funny. Ellie snapped. That thing knew my name. Martin's face darkened. Ellie, listen to me. That seat, it's not just a ghost story. People say it's tied to the fire that happened here years ago. The usher who died. He was sitting in that seat when the fire started. Some say he's still here, watching, waiting. Ellie didn't wait to hear more. She grabbed her bag and left the theater, vowing never to return. Weeks later, the Regal Theater closed its doors for good. The Midnight Horror Marathon was its last event, and few people seemed to notice its absence. But those who attended that final screening told strange stories of flickering lights, unexplained chills, and the feeling of being watched. And in Theater 3, Row J, Seat 12, the stories continued. The seat remained empty, but patrons swore they could feel someone there, breathing down their necks. A shadowy figure that lingered just out of sight. The Regal Theater was gone, but its haunting presence remained, a chilling reminder that some stories never truly end.